Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our penultimate session for the live online conference. I've been waiting to use that word. You only get to use it once in the course of any online conference. We have a fantastic session here for you. It is going to be led by Paul Gardullo, who's the museum curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and by Candra Flanagan, who is a student and teacher and programs coordinator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture as well. Unfortunately, Lonnie Bunch was not able to join us today, but we're in great hands with Paul and Candra. Lonnie is off on Capitol Hill, and you're going to be finding out a lot of about the great conversations that have resulted with him and the conversations he's had with Paul and Candra on this really interesting topic today. So we're going to go ahead, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Paul. And I do invite you as we go along to use the chat box on the left corner of the screen. We're going to be taking your questions and comments and taking a real fascinating look at the enduring emancipation from President Lincoln to President Obama. Paul, thanks for being here.
Oh, it's great to be here, and thanks to you for having me. I'm so happy to follow up on Shannon's presentation from before. What a wonderful setup she provided for us and discussing questions of race and slavery and even connections to our current president. So I'm really happy that you all are engaged on this topic and excited. I'm thankful for the introduction. I hope we get to know each other well over the next 50 minutes. And before I launch into our discussion of Abraham Lincoln and emancipation, I want to let Candra say hi and introduce herself and tell us a little bit about the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Hello, I'm Candra Flanagan. I'm Student and Teacher Programs Coordinator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And if you'll indulge me, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our museum. Our museum was established by an act of Congress in 2003, making it the 19th museum of the Smithsonian Institution. Scheduled for completion in 2015, it will be built in the National Mall in Washington, D.C., on a 5-acre tract adjacent to the Washington Monument, which is the area encircled on the photo that you see. Currently, during this pre-building phase, the museum is presenting exhibitions, producing publications, hosting public events, and building our collection. There are 4 pillars upon which this museum stands. First, creating an opportunity for those who care about African American history and culture to explore and revel in this history. Second, using African American history and culture as a lens through which we see what it means to be an American. Third, telling the African American story in an international context. Fourth, serving as a place of collaboration, supporting and encouraging the work of local museums and educational institutions. As Lonnie Bunch, our founding director, says, this is not a museum that celebrates African American history solely for African Americans. Rather, we see this history as America's history. Next slide. To learn more about our museum, visit us at nmaahc.si.edu. Paul, I'm really looking forward to this exploration of a theme that's central to African American experience, but is undeniably a cornerstone of our American culture.
Yeah, it undeniably is, and I think I'd like to just move right into it and go to the next slide and actually skip one slide, because I'd like us all to look at this image as I'm giving a little overview to you all. Abraham Lincoln's issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation is a watershed moment in American history. It's a document as important as the signing of the Declaration of Independence or the moment of the ratification of the Constitution, because of the crucial work that it did in fulfilling the ideals of freedom and equality that those founding documents were built upon, and it began to extend them to all Americans. However, we need to understand that abolition and emancipation were philosophies and strategies that Abraham Lincoln rightly embraced, but only well into the course of the Civil War. And so I want to take a moment to look at this image, and you're all well trained in visual literacy now and have been probably for a long time, but coming right on the heels of Shannon's presentation, let's look at this and think about how this image depicts Lincoln's experience writing the Emancipation Proclamation. And I think Jonathan is getting ready to pop the question up.
Yep, it's up, and people are already sharing some interesting responses. A lot of revisions, a struggle, just to say just the right things, says Leanne.
Struggle. How is he depicted? great deal of thought and effort into it, yes.
Tattered.
Is there anyone else in the photo?
Disheveled. We're seeing words like tattered, disheveled.
Right.
Relaxed. Solo.
Solo. Okay. Well, I'll let the answers keep on coming in, and I'll just continue. One of the main points I want to make is that Lincoln wasn't always for emancipation. The transition of Lincoln from a moderate anti-slavery advocate to a full-fledged abolitionist can teach us much about the moral character and political power of the man, but also about the relationship between the powerless and the powerful, about leadership, and about the movement of history. But why is this important, this process and this understanding of this struggle important to us today? Well, one reason I would argue is in an age when to some the charge of any revision of political position as a flip-flop and the consideration of consistency is praiseworthy, history provides us with a major lesson in one of the most important political figures in American history, President Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's dilemma about slavery, his struggle with the idea of emancipation, and his ultimate embrace of the necessity of freedom from slavery for all enslaved African Americans provides us with an example of a man who learned from personal experience and who changed his mind in regard to one of the central issues in American history. But there are other important reasons as well for investigating this topic. And the person who had mentioned, yeah, he's flying solo there in his room, surrounded by sheets and sheets of paper and a disheveled mess. He didn't do it alone. The brief description for our session, that is very provocative, describes the Emancipation Proclamation as inevitable. But I think we need to clarify that bold statement by saying that if the proclamation that Lincoln signed was inevitable, it can only be seen as such because of the long and hard-won actions of African Americans, both enslaved and free, and their allies to put an end to the institution at the core of American economic, political, and social life. African Americans weren't just the beneficiaries of Lincoln's goodwill or benevolence. The struggle by enslaved and free black folk alike in the South and in the North, in the world of ideas and in battle, shaped and changed Lincoln's understanding of the cause of civil war. From not only a war for national unity, but a war for freedom and democracy. African Americans did not wait for emancipation. They forced emancipation with the help of white abolitionists often. And in many ways, in this struggle, we find the roots of the modern civil rights movement, a movement that for over a century crafted a memory of Abraham Lincoln to remind America of Lincoln's foundational role in continuing struggles for freedom, democracy, and equality. And so there outlines the three main themes that I want to address today. And we can go back a screen to look at them. I want to talk about with you all Lincoln's intellectual and political struggle with emancipation, the agency of African Americans in forcing the issue upon Lincoln and upon the nation in many ways, and then Lincoln's memory as a hallmark of emancipation and freedom in African American and American culture. So let's talk about the struggle for emancipation. In order to kind of really understand where we're getting to with emancipation in 1863, it's important to understand a bit more about and to teach a bit more about slavery. When Abraham Lincoln was born in February of 1809, African bondage in North America was already almost 2 centuries old. Slavery played a profoundly important role in the making of the United States. The institution grew from a handful of Africans that landed in Virginia in 1619 to the 4 million African Americans held in bondage on the eve of the Civil War in 1861. Enduring a system of brutal oppression, enslaved peoples developed a deep commitment to liberty. African Americans, both enslaved and free, had heard and understand and advanced American claims for human rights in the Revolutionary period. They challenged their masters to live up to these declarations by abolishing slavery in the emerging nation. While in the North, anti-slavery and abolitionist sentiment grew though much of northern industry and trade depended on products derived from slave labor. In the South, however, slavery became more entrenched, and explicitly so. Slavery deeply affected Lincoln's presidency, as it had affected much of his life and the life of the nation. It drove the movement for Southern secession and shaped Lincoln's efforts to save the nation. And so I want to briefly, lead with this moment of African American agency in slavery, because and to tie it together with this question of how brutal a system slavery was. I mean, this image of a man just known to us by his first name, Gordon, really demonstrates the power of the brutality of slavery. But in some ways, it doesn't provide us with the sense of enslaved peoples as agents in and of themselves. And I think it's important that we begin to rescue the political, the very real political struggles that black abolitionists and that enslaved peoples were involved in from on the ground throughout the 18th and 19th centuries in fighting for their own freedom.
Paul, we should just pause for a moment, because the image you've put up on the screen has really, it's really given people a lot to think about and talk about, and they are sharing a number of ideas about, and they're using their visual literacy skills and just their humanity to look at this picture and try to understand what's this person is thinking. And so we do encourage you to keep sharing, and if you're in groups and you want to continue to discuss this when we're done as well, this is a really interesting image as a point of departure.
Please do, and one of the reasons I saw someone's question pop up, or a comment, this image is overused, and yes, it is widely used in textbooks, and sometimes the overuse of an image can rob it of its power. For some, this is a very powerful image. For others, it's overused, and I think that's one of my points in putting this up here, is to kind of talk about our common or our general understandings of slavery, and maybe pushing beyond that to think about enslavement and resistance in some new ways today. And so I welcome your comments on those issues.
Well, I think with regards to whether the image is used too much, we have one person who made the point that for students, first of all, if they've never seen it, and someone else saying it's not used enough.
So on the eve of the Civil War, Lincoln was no abolitionist, but he did see African Americans as human beings with basic human rights. Slavery troubled him largely because it deprived human beings of those natural rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence. Though when challenged in a series of debates with Stephen Douglass in 1858, Lincoln was pushed to defend his beliefs in white supremacy. Black people, he claimed, were inferior people, not the equals of whites in many things. And this is a quote from Lincoln himself. "I will say then that I am not, nor have ever been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races." But with the presidential election in the fall of 1860, and Lincoln becoming the president of the United States, before he actually took office, 7 of the largest slave-holding states from the Deep South, among them South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, seceded from the United States, seizing federal property and declaring themselves an independent nation. By that spring, the bloodiest war in American history was underway, and it was only under these circumstances, through his powers as a wartime president, that Lincoln could finally bring himself, or be forced to put his anti-slavery convictions, moderate though they were, into action. And here on the next slide, we see a quote from Lincoln and his views about slavery's role and in the preservation of the Union in a letter to Horace Greeley from 1862. And it clearly shows that he's not totally sold on the idea of emancipation. He's going to do whatever it takes to save the Union. In this next image, I wanted to show you a picture of a freedmen's village from Arlington, Virginia. And this jumps forward a few years, but I wanted to give a sense of what is going on in the ground after the South secedes and Union and Confederate armies go to war. As Union armies moved into the South, thousands of slaves fled to Union camps. Although some Union officers sent the slaves back to their masters following Lincoln's policies, others allowed them to remain with the troops, using them as a workforce and dubbing them contraband of war. Abolitionists were enraged by this policy, and they labeled it, quote, timid, depressing, and suicidal. Traditionally, these contraband camps were makeshift tent village. So this image of Freedmen's Village, which became on the site of Arlington, close to Arlington National Cemetery, was really pretty nice in terms of what a contraband camp looked like. In the next slide, we get a sense of a different camp, more of a tent camp. And we learn a little bit about this contraband and the story of fugitive slaves and the role they played in advocating and fighting for their own freedom. There was a large debate about the recruitment of African American soldiers as a means of winning the war against slave power. The abolitionist and escaped slave himself, Frederick Douglass, was among African Americans who were angered and insulted that the descendants of African American heroes from the Revolutionary War and from the War of 1812 would not be allowed to fight in this new Civil War that had, in his opinion, the central issue of it was freedom for all Americans. Frederick Douglass makes a quote, "Colored men were good enough to help win American independence, but they are not good enough to help preserve that independence against treason and rebellion." And he asked, why would Lincoln attempt to fight the rebels with only one hand? Well, Lincoln did, in fact, was forced to turn to African Americans to help him fight the battle in the South. And some of it came at the prompting of his own generals. And there's wonderful stories of the two Union generals here, David Hunter and Benjamin Butler. They were both two generals, one in Port Royal and off the coast of South Carolina, the other in Louisiana, I believe, who both took it upon themselves to liberate or enlist fugitive African Americans and enlist them into fighting the war for freedom and for national unity, only to be called back by President Lincoln in 1862. It became pretty apparent, however, that the course of the war was not going to go well without further help. As war continued, Lincoln's views on racial issues changed. He came to appreciate the contributions that African Americans were making to the cause and became more outspoken on the subject. Lincoln was among those who praised the dedication and patriotism of black soldiers when they were finally invited in to serve in late 1862. And here's a picture of Christian Fleetwood. He was, as the caption says, he was one of 14 African American men who received the Congressional Medal of Honor. Quite a different look from the Contraband picture from before. Quite a different sense of stature when black troops are accepted into the Union Army and paid, though never paid with equal pay to white troops. And I wanted to just show you a few more pictures of the dignity of the black troops, most popularly of which you've heard is the 54th Regiment, Robert Gould Shaw's regiment. That was immortalized in the film Glory. And each of these black regiments had white officers. And here's a quote on this page from Ulysses Grant to Lincoln about his support of the use of black troops in the military.
Some interesting observations in the chat about how these images portray the soldiers. There's people using the words like pride, and commenting on what you talked about in terms of the difference between these two photos, the Contraband photo versus this one.
Yeah, I think it would be great if we could put up a chat in the middle where we can ask people what important, what things do you think black soldiers proved?
That's a great thing. We're going to go ahead and put that right up on the top as a reminder of our guiding question here for the next few moments. What important things do you think that black soldiers proved? By the way, you talked about the Medal of Honor a few moments ago. One of our participants asks and wonders how long after that it was again before a black soldier received the Medal of Honor. So
that's a great question.
That's a good question.
I think that's something
Thank you,
that
Melody.
we can bring into our discussion groups, and there might be, I don't know the answer to that. I think that there might be people in the room who do, or we can definitely get back on that question. I think it's important as we're getting through this to this question of black troops to give voice to women who were fighting for the cause as well. Most famously, Harriet Tubman helped many fugitive slaves escape to Union lines, and that is a great story where we can talk about questions of gender and gender roles and bring women's stories into the equation here.
And scroll through and look at some of the responses that your colleagues in today's session are sharing in terms of our guiding question. I think you'll find it interesting to see what other people are saying. If you're not taking a look, take a little bit of a look there and see what you find.
Having trouble with the scroll. Yeah, they seized their manhood. Right. I think one important thing as we get into, I want to come back to this question of the men in Port Royal and in South Carolina, and what it meant to them in a few short months when the Emancipation Proclamation would be signed and announced. So we'll continue on. These are great answers. These are great comments. And here's just a note. I wanted to play a little moment of Frederick Douglass, an important abolitionist and probably one of the main people who moved Lincoln's ideas about slavery being at the center of the Civil War. As we just say, let's listen to him talk about what his ideas were on the black troops for a moment.
On January Governor John A. Andrew of Massachusetts received permission from Mr. Lincoln to raise two colored regiments, 54th and 55th. Immediately I wrote my call, Men of Color to Arms, addressed to the colored citizens of the North. It appeared in my paper and was published in the leading journals. I concluded on the following note. Chance is now given you to end in a day the bondage of centuries, and to rise in one bound from social degradation to the plane of common equality with all other varieties of men. Remember Denmark Vesey of Charlestown. Remember Nathaniel Turner of Southampton. Remember Shields Green and Copeland, who followed noble John Brown and fell as glorious martyrs for the cause of the slave. Remember that in a contest with oppression, the Almighty has no attributes which can take sides with the oppressors. The case is before you. This is our golden opportunity. Let us accept it and forever wipe out the dark reproaches unsparingly hurled against us by our enemies. Let us win for ourselves the gratitude of our country and the blessings of our posterity through all time. The raising of these two regiments, the 54th and 55th, and their splendid behavior in South and North Carolina was the beginning of good things for the colored people of the whole country. And not the least satisfaction I now have in contemplating my humble part in raising them is the fact that my two sons, Charles and Louis, were the two first in the state of New York to enlist in them. I continued to assist in raising regiments of Negro soldiers, using every argument of which I was capable to persuade every colored man able to bear arms to rally around the flag, help save the country, and save the race. But the attitude of the government at Washington caused me deep sadness and discouragement, and forced me in a measure to suspend my efforts in that direction. I had assured colored men that once in the Union Army they would be paid upon an equal footing with other soldiers, that they would be paid, promoted, and exchanged as prisoners of war. But thus far the government had not kept its promise, nor the promise made for it.
And I just wanted to make mention of the wonderful image of the storming of Fort Wagner that's here on the top of the page, and next to it is the casualty list of black soldiers who died in that battle. Let's get back to Frederick Douglass. While most African American and white abolitionists supported Lincoln and the Republican Party with great reluctance, Frederick Douglass was really a champion of Lincoln. He was a powerful abolitionist speaker, newspaper editor, and former slave. He disagreed with the depiction of Lincoln as the best of all evils and of the Republican Party, and he continues to embrace and tries, and one of the first to not only push Lincoln to actually get to meet Lincoln and to try to convince him of emancipation being necessary not only to success in the war but to the survival of the nation. He's also one of the first to begin to craft a memory of Lincoln after his death. So let's take a moment, just because Frederick Douglass's words are so much more powerful to listen to his statement on the Emancipation Proclamation, and later we'll get a sense of him again, his voice again.
The 1st of January, 1863, was a memorable day in the progress of American liberty and civilization. It was the turning point in the conflict between freedom and slavery. A death blow was then given to the slave-holding rebellion. And now, on this first day of January, 1863, a formal and solemn announcement was made that thereafter government would be found on the side of emancipation. The Emancipation Proclamation changed everything. It gave a new direction to the councils of the cabinet and to the conduct of the national arms. As I studied the proclamation more carefully, it became clear to me that it was extremely defective. Its operations were confined within certain geographical and military lines. It only abolished slavery where it did not exist, left it intact where it did exist. Nevertheless, I took the proclamation first and last for a little more than it purported, and saw in its spirit life and power far beyond its letter. Its meaning to me was the entire abolition of slavery, wherever the evil could be reached by the federal arm, and I saw that its moral power would extend much further. It was, in my estimation, an immense gain to have the war for the Union committed to the extinction of slavery, even from a military necessity. In my efforts to secure just and fair treatment for the colored soldiers, I went to Washington to lay the complaints of my people before President.
Well, both of those audio tracks are courtesy of Smithsonian Folkways. They're excerpts from Frederick Douglass's autobiography, dramatized by, does anyone recognize the voice? Ossie Davis. And perhaps we'll have time to see another, to listen to another reading of that powerful autobiography. But what Frederick Douglass really lays out there is the limitation of the Emancipation Proclamation, and I think everybody heard him when he said, the proclamation was limited. It applied only to slaves held in rebellious states, and it was ultimately provisional. It depended on a Union victory. But it also officially enlisted the cause of black troops in the war. It marked a major change in the significance of the war, which increasingly became, as Douglass so eloquently put it, a moral struggle for freedom. And so I want to give us two images of the signing of the the Emancipation Proclamation. Here is one of Lincoln. He received copies of the proclamation to review during the late morning, and rereading the document, he was overcome with the gravity of the occasion, and he paused to gather his nerves before signing, and he told those present, quote, "I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do signing this paper." Obviously, he understood the document's historic importance, and he continued, "If my name," and that's a quote, "if my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it."
And we're going to put up a sort of side-by-side here for people to answer. The Emancipation Proclamation has been considered one of the great documents in the history of human freedom. And if you agree with the statement, go ahead and offer us a little bit of reason why on the left-hand box. And if you disagree, you can tell us why, or perhaps offer a little bit more or elaborate on your answer. So there's two side-by-side boxes there. So feel free to do that as Paul continues.
While we're doing that, let's think about, I would like to talk a little bit about how the Emancipation Proclamation was received, not just by a room full of powerful white men, but how it was received by African Americans, young and old, men and women alike. Celebrations were not considered official until word was received that the president had actually signed the proclamation. Although the presidential decree would not free slaves in areas where the United States could not enforce the proclamation, it did send a strong signal to the slaves and the Confederacy that enslavement would no longer be tolerated. An important part of that signal was the invitation to the black regiment, for the slaves rather, to take up arms and participate in the fight for their own freedom. And remember those black soldiers at Port Royal, the ones who had been once listed as contraband and were threatened to be returned to their slave owners, and then ultimately made into and commissioned as black soldiers. That regiment celebrated the proclamation upon hearing the proclamation by spontaneously singing "My country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing." They didn't sing a Negro slave spiritual, although they probably did right after that, but the word came out that they sang this song. It was a moment of claiming country and freedom both. And it's a powerful story, and a song that resonates well into the 20th century, as we'll see in a few minutes.
And thank you for sharing some of your thoughts on the boxes, and we hope that's also the kind of dialogue you'll continue to have with each other, with your students, with your colleagues as well.
Yeah, and I think that will come into greater contrast when we get to discussing the differences between the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. So perhaps we can keep it up there and see how answers change. So regardless of where he stood at the start of the war, by his second term in the presidency, Lincoln had moved closer to the position, staked out more than 3 decades earlier by black revolutionaries such as David Walker, who had asserted that, quote, "America is more our country than it is the whites. We have enriched it with our blood and labor." And I wanted to take a moment here at Lincoln's transition from, as we said earlier, from a moderate anti-slavery supporter to a full-fledged abolitionist. It was recognized as such by Southern secessionists, including John Wilkes Booth, who heard Lincoln speak, and we learned a little bit about his second inaugural, who heard Lincoln's second inaugural, and it was just too much to bear. Booth left the White House grounds with his companion denouncing any plan that might result in black citizenship. "Now, by God," he said, "I'll put him through." Booth added, "That's the last speech he'll ever make." Now, that wasn't in direct relation to his inaugural, but a speech very soon thereafter. Lincoln did move more toward full citizenship rights toward African Americans. Unlike the limited Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution declared freedom for all persons in the country by declaring slavery illegal. Its passage marked the end of the Civil War and a new era for the reunified nation. Lincoln went on record in support of the 13th Amendment, which was working its way through the ratification process when Booth assassinated him. Though the amendment's reach was much broader than the Emancipation Proclamation, it's the proclamation that has been remembered and celebrated for nearly 150 years and is the topic of our discussion today. And I thought that was I think that's a really provocative thing to grapple with and think about. And I wonder if we can talk a little bit about why we remember and commemorate Emancipation and the Emancipation Proclamation, rather, and more so than the 13th Amendment. Do y'all think it has to do with being a legal document?
We have Jonathan who's saying from Lakes Area Charter School, Lincoln was president during the Emancipation while Johnson was president when the 13th was ratified. We have Christy and a few others who are saying this is a really great question, by the way. Diane Dawson says the 13th Amendment limited women's rights for the first time in the Constitution. Women were excluded directly.
That's right. It's very interesting to see how these documents, that as we celebrate the importance of these documents, we get into the nuance and discover what freedoms were limited as well as what freedoms were gained. The Emancipation Proclamation had blood spilled to enforce it. Very powerful. Yeah, I think I don't have an answer to this question, and I love what's coming through. I think it's continually interesting. I think there's another interesting parallel to be made between the Declaration of Independence and certain aspects of the Constitution. I think the spirit in which some documents are written, I think who writes them is often something that goes into how well people remember them and celebrate them over time. We're getting a correction about the 13th and 14th Amendment.
Somebody saying without the Emancipation Proclamation there wouldn't be a 13th Amendment.
It was a massive transitional moment in American history. And it was a transitional moment that African Americans sought to capitalize on right away. They recognized how important their actions had been in pushing forward this movement, and they felt the need to consolidate and crystallize the importance of this movement over time. And so I'd like to really move forward and talk about, since we're talking about memory now, to move forward and talking about how African Americans attempted to shape the memory of Lincoln and to really crystallize this moment of emancipation as the moment to remember. By the end of his life, Lincoln had grown what he said himself to be early on, that he was anti-slavery. But he was still growing and showed definite signs of becoming much more. He was moving beyond his earlier views of white supremacy, and his relationship with Frederick Douglass and the experience of the war in which he called on the service of African Americans were among the most influential factors in his personal growth. African Americans generally understood this growth, and most loved Lincoln for it. They observed Lincoln's death in many ways, Thousands stood along the route in silent tribute as the train that bore his body home to the state of Illinois. Most were realistic about Lincoln and understood that he had been a conservative anti-slavery man at best for most of his life, but they appreciated and became devoted to the memory of the abolitionist that he had become by the time of his death. By the time Douglass delivered his message to the crowd at the this is Frederick Douglass. I was going to play you a clip from Frederick Douglass on Lincoln's death, but I think given the interest of time, let's skip that and just talk about how Douglass was one of the first, as I mentioned before, to begin to craft a memory of Lincoln, of Lincoln as an emancipator. And this picture here shows a statue here in Washington, D.C., often called the Freedmen's Memorial or the Emancipation Memorial, dedicated in 1876. Frederick Douglass was at the unveiling of the memorial, which most of the contributors to this memorial were African Americans, many of them soldiers who had fought for their freedom in the Civil War. But I also want to point out, despite this fact, the monument still shows Lincoln as a wise and benevolent emancipator to a subservient slave. And we can talk about, I think that's talking about the negotiation of what it means to be an emancipator and what it means to emancipate oneself is an interesting negotiation that we need to kind of come to grips with in the late 19th and early 20th century. Lincoln had become a white martyr for black freedom, an image that remained strong among African Americans through the rest of the 19th century and most of the 20th century. So I want to take us up into the 20th century now and look at a few ways in which African Americans attempted to craft memory of Lincoln and emancipation. The first here is a image of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, a group that was born out of the embers of the Niagara Movement, a short-lived civil rights organization that was founded in 1905. The NAACP was founded in 1909. That means we're celebrating its 100th anniversary today. It was celebrated very strategically on the centennial of Lincoln's birth. And it was founded to coincide with the Lincoln Centennial. Born from the failure of the country to fulfill the promise of emancipation, now in a world of rigidly growing legal segregation, the NAACP tied its mission to Lincoln's legacy, declaring itself to complete, quote, the work the great emancipator began. But other constituencies had different ideas about how to remember Lincoln and celebrate his legacy. Official celebration of Lincoln's 100th birthday focused almost exclusively on his role as savior of the Union. African Americans and their white civil rights allies pressed for a national remembrance of Lincoln as emancipator, but they were generally ignored. The Lincoln Memorial, which the idea of which was hatched around the centennial, was finally dedicated in 1922 on the National Mall, but in a segregated ceremony, whose seating was enforced by military ushers. While the NAACP attempted to claim Lincoln's legacy as the great emancipator, the memorial was designed and built with the aim toward honoring the impulse to reunify Northern and Southern white Americans, pushing aside the understanding of Lincoln's struggle for emancipation and equality. Many black Washingtonians left the dedication in protest. Here we see an image of that ceremony. Despite setbacks, African Americans continued to focus on the idea of and the importance of Lincoln as an emancipator. And here brings us to a concert given at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1939 by Marian Anderson. Do many of you know about this concert? It really became a moment a watershed moment that was able to recenter the Lincoln Memorial, or actually first place the Lincoln Memorial as a struggle for equality, racial justice, and civil rights. It's a less known moment in 20th century struggle for civil rights, and it pushes back our typical understanding of the civil rights struggle well in a couple of decades. And I'm happy to talk about that at more length afterwards. Can we go back a little? Back to Marian Anderson? Looks like we forwarded back. Okay. I wanted to stop and pause here because Marian Anderson was a world-renowned contralto contralto, and she sang in the capitals of Europe. She sang in the best opera houses in the world. When she came to the United States to sing at the Daughters of the American Revolution Constitution Hall, she was not allowed because she was black. Grassroots organizations, civil rights organizations, advocated for her and ultimately won that right for her to sing at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where she sang the song "My Country 'Tis of Thee" with its refrain of "Let Freedom Ring." And the song that Anderson, just to me, hearkening back to those black soldiers who sang the same song upon hearing the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, is a powerful connector, gives us a powerful sense of the Proclamation's legacy, Lincoln's legacy, and the variety of uses for which African Americans used it and continue to use it. It was continued used most famously by Martin Luther King Jr. on the steps of the same Lincoln Memorial in 1963, 100 years after the Emancipation was signed. King quoted Lincoln. He spoke highly of Lincoln in his address. And 1 month ago, Aretha Franklin sang the same song, "My Country 'Tis of Thee," from the other end of the National Mall at the inauguration of Barack Obama as the 44th president. And this slide I put up here from the We Are One concert on January 19th really, to me, talks about the memorial and Lincoln itself and the transition of a site of struggle against exclusion, as I wrote in the caption here, becoming a platform to celebrate inclusion. So I realize we've quickly running out of time. We popped up a question earlier about what the emancipation means to you, and I think that would be a wonderful question to end our discussion with, and to move into the chat rooms with, because it's a provocative question. I think it's important that we understand the Emancipation Proclamation as not just something that lived in 1863, but has been continually reinvented and reused for over a century, and what it means at this moment in history is provocative. And I think that Shannon, in our last presentation, really began to unlock some of the possibilities of comparing moments in history in very intriguing ways. So with that, I'd just really like to say thank you to you all for participating. Thank you to Jonathan and Candra for helping me out. And I really look forward to hearing more and reading more of these comments and your ideas and questions. It's been a real pleasure.
Paul, thank you very much. Candra as well. A really thought-provoking session with some striking images and a lot of great dialogue, which is really the sign of time well spent together. So thank you, Paul, very much. We will leave the chat open so people can continue to reflect on this really important question about what does emancipation mean to you, and many of you are doing just that. We'll be back in about 7 minutes to close with a final session from a teacher who's going to be sharing some lesson ideas for teaching Lincoln in your classroom, and she'll be inviting you to share some of yours with her as well. So we'll introduce her in about 7 minutes. Stay right where you are. Thanks again.